Hello, my name is Megan Herold, and today I will be talking about the Johnstown flood and sharing some facts behind it, some of the main information, and also telling a few survivor stories of some of the railroad members who worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad at the time, some of which witnessed it happen. So I'll start with the overview of the 1889 tragedy. So Johnstown was built into a river valley on the Appalachian Plateau. Little Conemaugh and Stony Creek rivers ran along the town and formed the Conemaugh River at the western end. So basically these two rivers kind of merged to create the larger Conemaugh River. At least once a year, one or both of the rivers overflowed into the streets, sending town residents into a frenzy to protect what they could of their homes and belongings. So this was something that happened pretty frequently, and a lot of people never thought that the dam itself would break. Many described the flood as a rolling hill of debris, and a spillway should have been added years before, but no one could have imagined that the dam would break. A lot of people just thought it was hearsay. Response to the flood was immediate. Over 100 newspapers and magazines sent writers and illustrators to Johnstown. Many of the residents of the town set up tents near or around where their old homes used to be because they needed to clean up and try and start their lives again. And the city actually continued to suffer floods for almost 50 years. One newspaper clipping that I found really interesting was from the New York Times. As mentioned from the last source, everybody was rushing to share what they had heard happened in Johnstown, and even as far as New York and all across the country. So from the New York Times, here's just a little excerpt of something that was said. The city of Johnstown swept completely away. A lake on the neighboring hills bursts its barriers and sweeps everything before it. Men, women, and children swallowed up by angry flood, awful scenes witnessed by survivors. And another one from May 31st that came from Pittsburgh said, an appalling catastrophe is reported from Johnstown, Cambria County, the meager details of which indicate that the city of 25,000 inhabitants has been practically wiped out of existence and thousands of lives have been lost. Now, although some of these things were true and accurate, some of the farther away places that were reporting on these things may have been exaggerating a bit since they weren't closer, but a lot of people had family members from farther away that shared what was going on. So then here, before I get into the survivor stories and share what some of the people had to say who worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad at the time, here are some statistics about the Great Disaster that I found very interesting. So overall, 2,209 people died from the flood. Just crazy to think about. Even though there were over 25,000 people in the town, that's a big number. 99 entire families died, including 396 children. 124 women, 198 men were left widowed. And more than 750 victims were never identified and rest in the plot of the unknown in Grandview Cemetery. It's crazy to think about, for those who did survive, how many of their family members and loved ones and friends had passed away. Everyone had to know somebody who did. Bodies were found as far away as Cincinnati and as late as 1911. So just take a minute to think about that. This happened in 1889, and some bodies were found as late as 1911. I just think that that is crazy. 1,600 homes were destroyed and $17 million in property damage. $17 million in property damage. 4 miles of downtown Johnstown were completely destroyed, and the pile of debris at the stone bridge covered 30 acres. The distance between the dam and Johnstown is 14 miles, so that's about how long the flood was. The dam was owned by a South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, and it was an exclusive club that counted Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick as a few of the members. The dam contained 20 million tons of water, about the same amount as goes over the Niagara Falls in 30 minutes, which is just crazy that it was that fast. flood lines found as high as 89 feet above river level. The Great Wave measured 35 to 40 feet high and hit Johnstown at 40 miles per hour. $3,742,818 was collected for Johnstown relief effort within the U.S. and 8 foreign countries. So it wasn't even just our nation that was helping out once they heard what had happened. The American Red Cross, led by Clara Barton and organized in 1881, arrived at Johnstown on June 5, 1889, and it was the first major peacetime disaster relief effort of the Red Cross. So that's pretty cool. Helping out with the flood was the first major relief effort of the Red Cross. And then it is important to note that the 1889 flood was not the only flood. There was also a bigger flood in 1936 and 1977. Neither of these floods were as catastrophic as the original 1889 flood, but they were still bigger than just the average, how I mentioned before, where residents of the town were used to smaller floods very frequently throughout the year. So now I will get into a few of the statements. One of the first ones is the statement of William Adams. 59 railroad employees were interviewed in total on what they saw of the flood and the railway disasters. And John Hampton conducted the interviews to make sure that no employees had any involvement in the flood or its damages. So all of this was found on the Johnstown Area Heritage Association website, and William Adams, he was one of the first that was interviewed, and he was at the top of the list on the website. So I will start with him. William saw the flood occur and was able to escape with his wife to a hill. He saw his train be washed away from the tracks from the hills. Because he was working this day and saw all of this happen, he was at the top of his boss's list for an interview. And he was able to leave the train and save his wife's life just in time, which is crazy with how quickly the waters were rushing. He was asked multiple times if he would have stopped the train further up the tracks, if it still would have been destroyed. And he was shocked whenever the train was washed away, but I think in that moment it was just a fight or flight. Everybody had to rush for the hills, and he did. He was able to get his wife and rush for the hills. The next statement was by conductor S.E. Bell. He saw the Johnstown flood. He saw it out towards Conemaugh, but parts of a track were washed away by the river and transported to different tracks due to the flooding. He actually heard the alarm whistle sound for the town and heard most of the flood from the train. He said that the flood looked like a tall wall, and that's how many of the survivors described it. He didn't think that the flood would strike the train, so he didn't alert passengers. He got off the train, tried to alert passengers, but it was a bit too late. He made a run for his life, and he had worked for the train station for over 17 years. He was also asked, like the last person interviewed, if there was anywhere safer that the train could have been parked. And he said that pretty much all of the local tracks were covered or washed away. Some passengers stepped out of cars and stood on the tracks to see the flood occurring. Now, luckily, he did head back into the train before he ran for his life, and all of the passengers were able to get out and start running for the hills, and they had to run about 50 to 60 yards for safety. He saw many houses and people destroyed and killed in the wake of the flood. From the hills, they were able to see that the baggage car and one coach was swept away by the flood. Thankfully, no one from his train was killed. The next statement was from H.M. Bennett, and he worked on engine 1165, and he was attached to a regular freight train that started at Conemaugh. Cars started going off the track. A tree actually struck their engine. He saw the flood coming and also began moving some people off of the train. After the tree had struck the train car, they almost ran into another train that was up ahead trying to rush away from the flood, but they were able to stop just in time before they wrecked into it. The workers abandoned their train, and there were, I think, 5 train cars that were left on the rail car, and they found a safer one to jump on, almost getting hurt many times. He heard that the dam might break, but didn't believe it at first, until people started coming and sharing about the rising waters. He went to the office to report to a lady operator, but the lady said that she had no further communication past Mineral Point, because at that point it had already been hit by the water. 4 cars in the cabin of his train were washed away, and he said he never saw water so high. The last statement was from freight agent Decker, and he worked at Johnstown as a freight agent for 21 years. He didn't notice initially the rain much at first due to working in an office, and he was actually at his house when the actual dam broke. He heard screaming, ran outside, and houses were falling everywhere. When the platform of the he went for the platform of the railroad and climbed up the bank, and he received a message about South Fork Dam at about 3 p.m., and it said that the dam would possibly go. But again, many people didn't take this seriously. He still did feel the need to leave the office and telephone over the central office when he received some of these messages. He notified as many locals as possible, but many still ignored. And he discussed the direction of the current and mentioned that some people didn't have time to leave their houses even though they wanted to. Many did not believe that the flood was coming. And although over 2,000 people ended up dying in the wake of the Johnstown flood, it was spread so rapidly. Everybody around the area knew what was happening, and even nationally and even internationally. And it's one of the biggest events, I think, that occurred in Pennsylvania that I think even today a lot of people still need to be hearing about. Thank you.